Aylward left her home in England to answer God's call to take the message of gospel to China. In 1938, the region where she was living was invaded by Japanese forces, and Aylward led more than 100 orphans to safety over the mountains, despite being wounded, and personally caring for them, and many converted to Christianity. Time after time, God helped her triumph over impossible situations. And some of this you can read in a biography by Alan Burgess called The Small Woman. And there's a picture of Gladys there. Now, this is an example of overseas mission, but what is mission? You know, mission at its heart has a sense of sending and being sent. And in fact, the root word of Latin means this. In our passage this morning from Matthew's Gospel, we find Jesus fulfilling the mission of his Father and encouraging his disciples to do the same. Matthew tells us that at that time, Jesus was traveling with his disciples throughout the towns and villages in the region of Galilee, teaching in the synagogues and announcing the good news of the kingdom. And on that journey, he was healing people of disease and sickness, and of course, operating out of that heart of love and care. And care is the first theme I want to bring out of our passage today. When Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion on them. In verse 36, it says, because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Jesus lamented. He was grieved to the core by the Pharisees' neglect and mistreatment of the people. Time and time again, it says in the Gospels that Jesus reacted out of that heart of love and kindness. He's the shepherd king referred to in Psalm 23, who loves and cares for his people. And the Lord calls us to have that same compassion for others, whoever they are, whatever their background. How are we showing the Lord's care to others at this time? Whether it's supporting community projects like Hope St. Mellons, or offering practical help to a neighbour, or food for the food bank, let's reach out to others with gospel hands. Even small acts of kindness can make a big difference, just like throwing a little pebble into a pond and the ripple effect that you have coming out from it. And there's something important the Lord specifically calls Christians to do, and that is to pray. Pete Gregg, the founder of 24/7 Prayer, says this about prayer. The hinge of history is the bended knee. Prayer changes the world. So prayer. You know, Jesus said, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into the harvest fields. You know, our neighbour, Sam, he's got an allotment in Penarth, which he absolutely loves. And he's got a really good selection of soft fruit and veg growing there on his patch. Now, the process of harvesting refers to that time of the year when crops are cut and gathered in. And obviously it's seasonal, isn't it? And at the moment, Sam is awash with gooseberries. And he said to me the other day, would I like some gooseberries? And last night there was a tap at the door. We had a pellet of loganberries. Very kind neighbour, he's brilliant. Now, the harvest, of course, Jesus is referring to here are multitudes of people. And he's saying to his disciples, the harvest is great and the needs are great, but the labourers are so pitifully few. All ministries are ultimately under God's call. He is the Lord of the harvest. But the Lord does seek our cooperation in prayer and being willing to go. Are we willing to be the answer to our own prayers? And like the prophet Isaiah said, "Here I am, Lord, send me." I like the Message version. Jesus said, "What a huge harvest." And he said to his disciples, "How few are the workers. On your knees and pray for harvest hands." The prayer was no sooner prayed than answered, because Jesus called 12 of his disciples and he sent them into ripe fields. I wonder, were the disciples surprised at the Lord's request? It's one thing to pray for the Lord of the harvest to do something. It's quite another to hear him say, "Go." We must be prepared to be the answer to our own prayers. You know, I don't know how many of you here have heard of Street Pastors, the initiative of the Ascension Trust, pioneered in London in 2003 by Les Isaac. Individual street pastors are Christians with a concern for their community who undergo 12 days of training in order that they can voluntarily patrol the streets of towns and cities at night, helping and caring for very vulnerable people in practical ways. Some of you might know that Andrew, my husband, is a street pastor, and I remember the initial part of that training was very much shadowing an experienced street pastor, to learn from them, to be trained by them and see what it was all about before then being launched into starting your own shift with someone else. And I want to bring the theme of receive now before us. Because before launching out themselves, the disciples had to receive two things from Jesus. And first was training. The 12 had been receiving training by watching the example of Jesus. And indeed, of course, the best way to receive training is not in the classroom, but through practical first-hand experience. The disciples must have learned so much by being around Jesus. But even then, the thought of going out without him must have been a daunting prospect. Training is important, but they also needed to receive authority from Jesus. And this, of course, is what he did give them, and he enabled the 12 to perform ministries that the Jewish leaders could not accomplish. And as believers today, we need to put our trust in Jesus and receive from him. We need to be filled with his Spirit to be affected. We have his authority that he gives us. And it's reassuring to remember that we don't go alone. God goes with us. He equips us. And there's that promise in Matthew chapter 10, verse 20. When we go, it will not be you speaking, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. The power of the Lord and the mission of the Lord belong together. And this is emphasized at the end of the gospel. Christ has all power. He's always with us, but he tells us to go and make disciples. And the Holy Spirit is given to us for that mission. So go. That's my last theme today. Go. You know, who of the disciples responded to the call to go? Well, it was all of them. The actual word apostles means sent ones, ambassadors, messengers, authorized and sent to represent God and to accomplish specific tasks. Luke says they went out 2 by 2 for mutual encouragement and support. You know, they were not all evangelists by temperament, but they were all sent to be God's witnesses to share the good news. And where did those disciples go? It says in verse 6, they were to go to the lost sheep of Israel. You know, Jesus limited the mission at that point to just the Jews, and it was through the Jews that God would then reach the Gentiles. They had a clear objective. They were to go to the lost, to the distressed, and to the poor. And in verse 7, Jesus said to the disciples, as you go and proclaim this message, the kingdom of heaven has come near, heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, and drive out demons. How did they go? Well, they must go expecting God to work. They must go expecting to be poor, but to have enough, says that in verse 9 and 10. Verse 20, they must go trusting the Spirit of God to speak through them. Verse 26, they must go in confidence, knowing that God is in control. The disciples were to put their full trust in God's provision. You know, he said, freely you received, so freely give. You know, the disciples followed Jesus all the way on that journey to the cross. And all the disciples were called to put their life on the line. And we are called too, as ambassadors, as messengers, as sent ones, to be part of this mission, even today. But disciples shouldn't fear, because it is God that's with us. He reigns and he's in control. Commitment to mission requires not only assessment of need, but also a compassionate response in spiritual and material terms. But the challenge for us at this moment in time is, how do we go? How can we be messengers and ambassadors at this time of this pandemic situation? If we were to climb on top of the church, I'm not, the health and safety one in there, I'm not asking you to do this, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, we got one of those cherry pickers and we kind of lifted ourselves up, got on the top of the church, and maybe were able to elevate ourselves that little bit more. What needs would we see? And for those of you in Canton, in Coles Hill, and in Edinburgh, and wherever we are, what needs would we see in our community? I don't need to spell it out. We know what they are. We know what they are. We know there's loneliness. We know there's pain, physical pain, mental pain. We know there's fear for the future, a lack of hope, total concern about finances, whatever it might be. We know that there are sheep all around us, harassed, just like when Jesus saw those people that were so desperate for compassion and for love. We are called to reach out to our communities, to St Mellons, to Trowbridge, to Rhymney, and elsewhere. We are called to be able to be God's servants and ambassadors. As his disciples, we're called to care, to pray, to receive, and then to go. These themes are the call of mission for all believers. We're made for mission as believers. God is at work in the world, and he wants you to join him. What part can you play? You know, it's funny, the other day, I was just at a picture of just a table. On the table were some coins. And I don't necessarily suggest you do this now, but it got me thinking that if each of those coins that you put out on the table represented the gifts God's given you, whether it be that God has given you a particular heart for prayer, that God has given you a particular gifting of just talking to people and coming alongside people. For others, it'll be the gift of teaching, like Brad. You know, what if I asked you this morning to put those coins in front of you and each represented one of those giftings? You know, I know some of us, we sometimes feel perhaps a little bit, you know, we perhaps don't even know some of what our giftings are. But for the things that you do know, how can you be using those at this time, in this challenging situation moving forward? Because we're all unique, we've all got different giftings, and it's the call of God today for us to go in mission, but to use that spread of gifts that God has uniquely given to you. Perhaps that can be some sort of homework for you this week as you begin to be challenged to think about how we reach folks around us with their needs, those sheep that God has called for us personally to reach out to. Think about that this week. Just lay some of those things before you and ask the Holy Spirit to stir your hearts, because you might be surprised. There might be a gifting that you haven't used for many years, but now is the time to stir that gifting up to be used for Him. So in summary, we need to care, we need to pray, we need to receive, and we need to go. What part can you play? And are you willing? Amen. As we reflect on some of the things I've spoken about this morning,